Tonight's speaker is David Foote. I don't know if you all heard his last presentation on Pitcairn Island, but I did, and I'm really looking forward to what David's going to tell us about Norfolk tonight. Anyway, David was born in England. He was brought up in Australia and received his bachelor's degree from the University of Western Australia. Then he was educated in the United States and received his doctorate in economics from Harvard University. He moved to Canada in 1971, accepting an appointment at the University of Toronto, where he became professor of economics. He is now happily retired, enjoying travel when possible. I think that's kind of on hold right now, isn't it, David? Tennis, and of course, philately. His philatelic interests are focused around the British Pacific area, and he has a topical collection on solar eclipses. He joined the PSSC in 2003. He has spoken to PSSC on Western Australia twice, Thursday Island, Eclipse Philately, Pitcairn Island, and briefly on Australian rocket mail. Tonight he will talk about Norfolk Island, and I turn it over to David.
All right, well, thanks, Ken, for the introduction, and thanks, Charles, for hosting this, and also to Durban for kicking us off very well last month. And also many thanks to Michelle Hood, whose assistance and advice I couldn't live without. So let's move forward. Where is Norfolk Island? Most of you may know where it is, but where is it? It's between New Zealand and New Caledonia, off the east coast of Australia. It's on the volcanic ridge called the Norfolk Ridge, and it's almost equidistant to Sydney or to Auckland, and Lord Howe Island is on a different ridge here, and you may come back and see something about Lord Howe Island in the future. It comprises 3 islands, the main island, which is inhabited, and 2 small islands, which are not inhabited. So some people refer to Norfolk Islands, just like they refer to Pitcairn Islands, but only one of the islands is inhabited, Norfolk Island. There are 3 main spots or settlements on Norfolk. Kingston at the bottom, which is where the original settlement was, Burnt Pine, which is sort of the main village today, and Cascade on the north side. Now, the ports are at Kingston and Cascade. So if the wind is coming from the south, you go and unload your boat on the north side in Cascade. If the wind's coming from the north, you go and unload your boat on the south side in Kingston. Some of you may remember this map from my Pitcairn presentation. About half of the residents today are descendants or can trace themselves back to descendants of the Pitcairners. And in the 1856, the Pitcairners were moved right across the South Pacific. It took them 5 weeks to get to their new destination, and 1 more arrived than left because there was a kid born on the route. That was in 1856. So most of the current residents, or many of the current residents, have Pitcairn-based names. There's still a quick connection between Norfolk and Pitcairn. Here's a 1930 cover from Pitcairn to Norfolk, and here's a more recent cover, 1985, from Norfolk to Pitcairn. And this is what the settlement looks like in Kingston area of Norfolk Island, but these weren't built by the Pitcairn Islanders. They hated these houses because they like to be able to talk to one another through walls, and these solid stone walls did not participate, did not encourage speaking between them. So who built these things? And that's what we're going to now find out. So quick overview of what I want to try and accomplish today. First of all, looking at the early settlements, and then the period that Australian stamps were used, and then the first issue of the Norfolk, followed by a pre-decimal period up to 1966, followed by the early decimal period, and then I'm going to throw up my hands and say the late decimal period has too much in it. And then a couple of little extra items, local mail, official mail, and some miscellaneous points. So that's my outline for today. The first early settlements were Polynesian. Archaeological evidence has suggested that Norfolk Island was on the extreme edge of the Polynesian triangle, which includes Easter Island, Hawaii, and New Zealand. And there may also have been some visitation from Melanesians down to Norfolk Island. But these were probably visitations, not settlements. We've seen fish hooks, there's been pottery, and there is the foundation of a house that's been discovered that's, they think, Polynesian, but it doesn't look like they settled for any length of period of time. Polynesians would have been there about 1350 or so, about the same time they were to visit New Zealand. The first visitor from our Western perspective was, of course, Captain Cook, who came in 1774 on his second voyage to the Pacific, the voyage that took him around to Antarctica, basically. And he crisscrossed the Pacific during that time, picked up Norfolk Island, landed on the North Shore, which is very, very steep, and there's a cairn to that visit today. This map was published in 1777, and so it's came out of his visitation. The first real settlement was an adjunct to the settlement in Sydney. In the 1770s, of course, you all know that Brits were the population was growing in England. The Brits were under a lot of pressure. They'd lost the colonies in America. Empress Catherine of Russia was cutting back on their hemp and flax, so they didn't have ropes and sails. And with the population growth, they needed an outlet, and Australia provided an excellent outlet for them. And so they sent a first fleet to Australia, 1788. And as an add-on, as a result of Cook's reports, as an add-on, they wanted an adjunct settlement in Norfolk Island, somewhat in addition to stop the French from settling, who were sneaking around the Pacific at that time. And so in 1788, the first fleet arrived in what is now Sydney, Australia. And then in the March of that year, they arrived in January. In the March of that year, a second group two ships went off to Norfolk Island and landed there in 1788. So the Norfolk Island was settled in the same year that Australia was settled. And anything from that first settlement, it was mainly an adjunct to the Sydney settlement. So it included some prisoners, some convicts, but it also included a lot of free people because they wanted to try and develop agriculture on Norfolk Island to help supply the settlement in Sydney. Anything from this period is extremely rare, but here we have a document dated Norfolk Island, 30th September 1802, signed by William Broughton and approved by J. Foreau. This is a request bill of exchange, if you like, to pay somebody £494, which was a lot of money in those days. So who were the signatures? Well, Foreau was one of the first commandants on Norfolk Island. In fact, he was actually the fifth commandant, but they went through a quick succession of commandants. Broughton was his favorite, one of his favorite people who he appointed to run the stores there. And Foreau was pretty vicious. Remember in the late 1790s, the Irish uprising, Irish rebellion, a lot of Irish were sent to Australia without trial to get them away from England. And some of the more vicious, at least that's the way that it was described at times, were sent on to Norfolk Island. And so there was a concern about Irish uprising. And in fact, a plot got to Foreau's attention. And after church services, he nabbed the ringleaders as they came out of church. And the two of them were hung and without trial. And one of the myths, and there's lots of grimy myths from Norfolk Island, the myth was that he had the two accused build the scaffolding that they were subsequently hung from. It's not clear that that's true, but that is one of the many myths of Norfolk Island. The point was that he was a pretty vicious commandant, although he did improve a lot of the island roads and seawalls and bridges and things like that. So this is a document from that first settlement. The first settlement continued to about 1814, and the reason in the early 1800s, about the time this letter would have been written, they were having a lot of difficulty producing enough produce even for themselves, let alone for the settlement in Sydney. And it was very remote, and it was very difficult to land ships and load cargo. So Norfolk Island ended up being a bit of a nuisance. It didn't pay its own way, and it wasn't easy to maintain. As a result, the last of the convicts, and remember, settlers had been given land. Fourveau had actually been given a lot of land grants in Sydney before he went to Norfolk Island. He'd arrived in Sydney in 1892, and he'd become a very, very rich man. And he had to sell his lands and livestock to take up this appointment as commandant. But basically, these free men also were on Norfolk Island. They'd been given land grants. And so to up and suddenly throw it all away was a bit of a difficulty. But ultimately, the settlement was closed as being uneconomic in 1814. The buildings were trashed because they didn't want the French or even the Spanish coming in and using them and using the island as a base in the Pacific. And the island lay fallow, and then basically until 1825. And this is the person who's been talking about, Major Joseph Fourveau. And then in 1825, a second penal colony was established there, and this was where supposed to be from the very worst offenders. These were people who had been transported to Australia for one offence and then committed additional offences while they were in Australia or in Australian territory, the colony of New South Wales, or subsequently also the colony of Van Diemen's Land in Tasmania. And this is a record of one of those convicts from this period. It was a very rough period, and a lot of nasty things went on. All of the convicts were in chain gangs. There were over 2,000 people on the island, and of course, a lot of them had to cut rocks to build buildings. But this particular guy, this is the conduct record of Abram Crabtree. He'd been sent to Van Diemen's Land, or Tasmania, in 1832, transported there. And while he was there, he committed additional misdemeanors such as gross neglect of duty, extorting money, refusing to work, fighting, insolence, gambling, absence from his gang, in liquor, etc. And I didn't even, going through that, I haven't even listed all the things that he was misdemeanored for. So he was given further punishments, including solitary and lashes, which are the main two sorts of punishment. And then removed and sent to Norfolk Island because he was a particularly bad specimen, where he was to be handcuffed for 7 years. Ultimately, he was returned to Van Diemen's Land in March 1850 and granted a free certificate in 1854, and we can't find out what happened to him. There's no record in the Australian convict records of what happened to him. But a lot of these people did get their free certificates and became very important people, lawyers, and certainly clergy in the second penal colony. So very little information comes, very little philalic information comes, but documents, you can find documents from these two periods. That the second penal settlement was closed in 1855, and finally the final people were taken back to Tasmania, which continued as a penal colony. And in 1856, of course, the Pitcairn Islanders arrived. And they were given land grants on the island. A lot of the buildings were preserved from that second settlement. So they were given houses, there were a water mill, they were given quite a lot of the buildings of the sort that we saw in that little picture at the beginning. And they weren't terribly happy. And the reason was that on Pitcairn Island, they owned Pitcairn Island. When they were transported to Norfolk Island, they were given land grants, but the Crown held back at least a third, nearly a half of the island, which subsequently has become national parks and so on. But that meant that the Crown could determine who lived on the island, whereas on Pitcairn Island, the Pitcairn Islanders got to determine who lived on the island. And that's been an ongoing problem for the Pitcairn Islanders on Norfolk Island. A couple of the Pitcairn Island families went back in 1858 and 1863, and they're the ones that now, of course, were the foundation for the Pitcairn Island settlement that I talked about 18 months or so ago. Very little supposed to have survived from the Pitcairn settlement, but we've got a few items here, and there's a couple more in the exhibit that would have been up on the walls if we'd had the chance. Here we have a letter dated Sydney, April 16th, 1860, and it's from Sydney to the Reverend G.H. Nobbs, addressed to Norfolk Island. So this is an incoming letter to Norfolk Island. There are no postal markings, and that's because almost all the letters into Norfolk Island over this Pitcairn period, the second half of the 19th century, were paid for in cash by giving them to captains to carry to the island. And so very little has either survived, and there's very little postal markings on these things. But this is a very early letter dated from Sydney to Norfolk Island, and is part of that period. I'm going to show you a couple more. Sorry, wrong direction. Here's one from England, from Frosel Park in Alton, England. Dear sir, and it's going to Mr. Nobbs. And I've showed the back because on the back of the envelope that this letter is enclosed in, we have an Alton cancellation from February the 18th. We have a London cancellation from February the 20th, and it arrived in Sydney on April the 17th, 1863. And there, of course, it went on to Norfolk Island by the kind permission of a captain on a boat. So this is a correspondence from that period where we can actually not only date it from its manuscript, but we can also date it from postal markings. Another one written via Southampton, October the 30th, 1868, to Reverend G.H. Nobbs, Norfolk Island, Australia. So it's another inward mail. And to give you some idea, Mr. Nobbs, as I'll talk about him in a moment, was Reverend, and here he was getting sent an invoice from the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, and it lists what his invoice was for. This correspondence came on the market only in about 2006, and a lot of it is damaged. This is not unusual, but it is very, very unique correspondence. We hardly had anything from this period until some of this correspondence showed up. And finally, here is a letter actually written on Norfolk Island in 1870, January the 18th, 1870, and signed by George H. Nobbs, chaplain. So that gives you some idea. This is the items from Norfolk Island, from the Pitcairners. Nobbs was a fairly well-known, he was almost the leader of the Pitcairn community on Norfolk Island. He lived till 1884 and was instrumental in leading the Pitcairn Islanders on the island and negotiating with the British. Very well-known person. By 1886, which is when this letter was written to Mrs. Nobbs, because on Kingston. Remember that southern port, Norfolk Island. And of course, he was then buried. This is a photo of his gravestone on Norfolk Island. By the way, I was in Norfolk Island about a year ago, and this is one of the photos I took while I was there. So we have quite a bit of correspondence for the Pitcairnists, but nothing really tying cancellations to Norfolk Island, because much in the last half of the 19th century, last half of the 1800s, was carried by ship captains and paid in cash. Moving forward, the first hand stamp. There was a brief period where Norfolk Island was no longer under New South Wales jurisdiction, but in fact was put under Tasmanian jurisdiction. And there are about 4 stamps and 1 cover from 1853 while it was under Tasmanian jurisdiction. Then, when that was closed down, it came back to New South Wales jurisdiction. And so in the 1890s, the post office in New South Wales agreed to supply stamps to Norfolk Island. It was an on and off thing. Again, postal postal arrangements were very on and off over that period. But there are a couple of examples in the 1890s of material that can be identified as originating in Norfolk Island. However, the first postmark, which is shown here on the right, that was made available in 1892, it wasn't shown to cancel any stamps, as distinct from being put on envelopes. It wasn't used to cancel a stamp until 1899. And here we have the use of that, and it usually is a very poor mark if you're good enough to find it, but you may be able to see OLK here for Norfolk Island, and an A over here. This is a transit through Auckland, New Zealand. Much of the mail would have either gone through Sydney or gone through Auckland over this whole period. So this is a very early use of that cancel on a New South Wales stamp. And I show what the other side, you can see it stated, by the way, Norfolk Island, March 30th, 1906. I want to show you the other side because there's a whole series of postcards at the early part of the turn of the century. And this is what the settlement looked like. Nice, these are officers' quarters and officers' houses down here. This little road down here becomes this road here. And this is the jail. This is the buildings associated with the penal settlement. And inside were a 5-wing jail with all sorts of solitary holes to put people in. Not a nice place. Over the 20s and 30s, a lot of these very well cut stones disappeared to make houses. But these buildings here are still available, can still be seen on Norfolk Island, and they're in pretty good shape. So this is the first Norfolk Island postmark that was used to actually cancel stamps. Moving on, in the early 1900s, about 1905, 1904, 1905, New South Wales supplied a further postmark, and this was a Norfolk Island postmark with New South Wales under the bottom. And so for a period in 1905 through to about 1914, 1915, this is a very late use of that mark. This postmark was the main postmark. You may notice that this particular one is on an Australian stamp. It's a kangaroo stamp, 4-penny kangaroo stamp. And that's because in the Australian Commonwealth, it became a Commonwealth in 1901. And for the first decade, it used its own previous colonial stamps, New South Wales stamps, it wasn't until 1913 that Australia finally got round to negotiating a deal with everybody to share the revenues and produce its own stamps. So in 1913, Australian stamps replaced New South Wales stamps, but this cancellation was still in use. But to move forward a little bit, because in early we moved into the 20th century, and the big issue as Norfolk Island ended the 20th century was the building of a cable station on the island, because this connected Norfolk Island to the rest of the world. The cable was ran, and here we have a nice connection. It was suggested by Stanford Fleming, by the way, in let me just look at a cheat sheet here. It was suggested by Fleming at a conference in 1887. He was worried that the cables were vulnerable. These are telegraph cables, were vulnerable because they weren't secure on British-owned territory. And the Eastern Cable Company had a monopoly. They established a monopoly through Egypt and so on up through the sea. They were their route went from Singapore, India, Suez to Gibraltar, and so it was quite vulnerable to damage. And Stanford Fleming suggested the Australians should have an alternative route through Canada to Europe, to the Great Britain through that way. So in 1902, the seabed was surveyed and the cable was laid. One ship coming this way and the other ship coming that way. Started in Vancouver, went through Fanning Island and then down to Fiji, and from Fiji to Norfolk Island. And Norfolk Island, then it split, one part going on to New Zealand and another part going on to Australia. So this was quite a significant role that Norfolk Island played. And here's a couple of envelopes, actually, inwards coming into the Pacific Cable Board on Norfolk Island. This one's from Mexico, registered from Mexico from 1916. This is from 1980. This one, the cablegram, this is one of the cables, is addressed to Archie Quintal, Ivy House, Norfolk Island. And Quintal, of course, is a very Pitcairn Island name. So 1902 and 1914, Australia, Norfolk Island in 1914, it became the British passed it to the New South Wales. It became an Australian territory in 1914. It had been with the New South Wales government from 1897 to 1914. In 1914, it was given an Australian territory, and it was then given an Australian chancellor. And so we have a Norfolk Island with Australia around the bottom. This started to be used patchily in 1914, 15, and so on. I have three covers here just representing different parts of that use. This is a cover, 1931 cover from Fanning Island coming in into Norfolk Island, and you can see the remains of this chancellor as a back stamp, of the receiving stamp on this cover. Here's an earlier cover, 1927, and this is a very interesting cover because, in fact, it is going to England, registered, but they didn't have registration facilities on the island. You could send registered, and it says posted out of course here. And so these covers then were either registered in Sydney or registered in Auckland, New Zealand. And the rate was, in fact, a penny halfpenny, and the registration fee was 3 pennies. And so 1 plus 2, these two paid the registration, this paid the mail. Excuse me. The penny halfpenny rate had been in existence since 1923. Previously, it had been a penny. Over here on the right, we show finally the use of a blank registration label on Norfolk Island. And this is a 1935 cover going to the US. It needed 3 pennies in postage, which is on the right, and then another 3 pennies for the registration, which is 2 plus 1 here. And they've got a hand stamp, Norfolk Island, across here. So this is a blank registration label, and both of them are paying correct rates. And this is for the first Australian postmark. In 1931, Sir Francis Chichester tried to be the first person to fly solo across the Tasman from New Zealand to Australia. He actually had been in his 20s. He went to New Zealand and knew New Zealand very well. He went back to the United Kingdom in the late 20s, where he trained to be a pilot. He got his pilot's license. He then flew this plane without the floats from England to Australia, trying to break the solo record. He didn't succeed, but he flew solo from England to Australia, then loaded his plane on a ship and had it shipped to New Zealand, and then started to come back and tried to be the first one to fly solo. He needed floats because, in fact, there was no airport on Norfolk Island, and there was the 2 ports, and both of them had areas where float planes could land if necessary. And this is an example of him flying his plane across. He left New Zealand on the 28th of March, which was a Saturday, and arrived, and he did it with just a sextant. It was a brilliant navigator. And so this cover couldn't be postmarked on the 28th, and Sunday was the 29th was Sunday, so the earliest it could be postmarked was the Monday, the 30th. And then the next day, he continued his flight, April 1st, April Fool's Day, by the way, on to Lord Howe Island, which was that little island on the way to Australia, and that turned out to be very difficult for him. He arrived on April 1st on Lord Howe Island. Itself has a very interesting postal history, which I might talk about sometime in the future. But he arrived on Norfolk Island, and he tied his plane down in the lagoon, a very nice lagoon on Lord Howe Island, and a huge storm came up, and the plane was smashed to smithereens, and he had to rebuild it on this little Lord Howe Island, which he did successfully do. But anyway, that's for another story. But this was the first plane to land on Norfolk Island in 1931. And by the way, you can see he was a Brit. He figured everything was upside down in the Southern Hemisphere, including the airmail labels. Moving on. A second CDS arrived in 1937 with Norfolk Island Ost with a period. This period turns out to be quite important. So this was used from 1937, and what we have here is it's King George V, 3 King George V type covers. This one on the top right, a penny, and the postage by this time was 2 pennies. That had come in 1930, and so the cover in the top right here is 1937, and I think what this is, it's a printed matter rate. This is a printed matter. Davis Brothers were, I believe, stationers, and I think this is a printed matter rate into Australia, into New South Wales, Australia. But it has this use of this cancel. This one also, Norfolk Island, going to England, has the use of the cancel. If you look there, there's a period there. And this is a double weight. It must have had a double weight cover. In the British territory, it was postage was 2p, so 2 times 2p is 4p, and this would have been a double weight use of the King George head. And that cover, I think, dates from 1927. And finally, this is a 1938 cover. But it's got it's using the previous Australia cancellation. It's going to the USA. Postage to the USA was 3 pennies. So the Sydney Harbour Bridge, 2p Sydney Harbour Bridge plus the penny King George V paid the 3 penny rate to Australia. So these are just 3 examples from the 1930s of different sorts of covers, one doing different sorts of things. Moving forward, the all up, and we heard about all up from at the Society at some stage in the past, otherwise known as the EAMS airmail. This is where you could fly anywhere in the British Commonwealth for a penny halfpenny. And it was, the Brits got the airmail routes established to Alexandria in 1936. And Ken Snelson can correct me if I step out of line here. The stage one of the EAMS, the all-up airmail, went on to South Africa. And so it went down, I think, to Durban, South Africa. It picked up a lot of the places along the route, and that took place in 1937. Stage two is then extended to Malaya in February 38, and it wasn't extended to Australia until July 38. And the idea was that airmail was becoming more and more important for the movement of mails, and the British, the home country wanted to re-establish their rights with airmail service within the British Commonwealth. There were also a bunch of other reasons, testing out aircraft and all the rest of them. So here's a couple of covers under the airmail scheme. And this one originated in South Africa on the 23rd of July and arrived in Norfolk Island on the 7th of September. This one originated in Liverpool, England on the 22nd of July and arrived, 24th of July, sorry, and arrived in Norfolk Island in September. Now, these would have been flown to Australia via Darwin to Sydney, and then actually would have been taken across to Norfolk Island by boat. And this is a third different cancellation with the AUST dot design, if you like. And here the K in Norfolk is very, very V-shaped, and it's slightly bigger than the others. And this cancellation only seems to have appeared on the incoming mail from the airmail scheme, the EAMS scheme. And the reason we can see that is the September looks like SF rather than SE. The bottom of the E is dropped off. So inward covers to Norfolk Island are a little different. But as I said, the airmail route didn't go all the way to Norfolk Island. It only went to Australia, and then these covers would have been shipped to Norfolk Island, and these are the receiving marks. Moving forward, we're up to 38 now, 1938. And of course, what looms next but wartime, 1939, the wartime. And here we have 4 covers from World War II, all from 1940. The earliest one is the 29th of January, 1940. And again, that's using that first postmark that I referred to. Then we go up to the 20th of April, 1940. And this is using the second postmark I'm referring to with the dot here. And both of these are actually censored, but the censor stamp is on the reverse. So the 2 left on the left here, the censor is on reverse. And apparently, Norfolk Island introduced censorship almost immediately the war started, and you'll see why in a moment. And in the early part of the war, they put their censor marks on the left. But later in 1940, and this cover is from August 1940, going to Australia, you can see a boxed censor mark. It's not very good here on the front. And by the time we get to down here, November 1940, with a nice packet boat, Sydney cancel, the box censor mark here is much clearer. Passed by censor 3, Norfolk Island. And Norfolk Island actually had 3 censors. Number 1 was, which is very hard to find, was used by the administration, the registrar's office, and number 2 and 3 were used for regular mail. By the way, it's a little bit of a curiosity to me of how you can censor a packet boat mail. If the censor was actually on Norfolk Island, why didn't they mail the mail on Norfolk Island? Why did they mail it on the ship? And if they mailed it on the ship, how does the censor not know that they've put some other stuff in the envelope in the meantime? So this is a real, I've got 3 covers like this with a censored with a packet boat. And to me, it's a real conundrum. But someone else may be able to solve it for me. So the 2 on the left, early 1940 covers, the censor marks on the back. 2 on the right, later 1940 covers, the censor marks are on the front. And as I said, there were 3 censors. So here you go. Passed by Censor 1, Norfolk Island, again a packet boat, Sydney, used by the official's office. Number 1 seems to always be used by the administrator's office. Going to Australia, I like this cover, a couple of wartime stamps, passed by Censor 2, going to Bangkok, Thailand. I think that's kind of neat. And number 3 here, passed by Censor 3, uses the old New South Wales stamps, which were still valid for postage. And there's that Ost dot postmark again, whereas this one's got the Fuel Australia postmark, and this one's got a packet boat postmark. And here we see a printed registration label, Norfolk Island, New South Wales. And these printed registration labels, I think, came in around 1938, 37, 38. And so that is the censorship side of the story. However, things get a little bit more complicated because Norfolk Island was in New Zealand's part of the responsibility for the Second World War. New Zealand was responsible for all the islands sort of to the east of Australia. Australia was responsible for the islands north of Australia. So Australians fought the Japanese coming into New Guinea and British Solomon Islands and so on, whereas New Zealand kept had forces in New Caledonia and places like that. So in fact, very early on, the New Zealanders came in to Norfolk Island. But before we go there, I have a couple of other examples of censor use. Here is Norfolk Island to Australia, Sydney, but it's censored by New Zealand. DDA is the censor calls for New Zealand. So this cover went through Auckland to Sydney. On the right, we have a cover going to Toronto, Ontario. And it's been censored in Sydney. Number 2 is the Sydney, both sealing and diamond-shaped stamp. By now, the local postage was 2.5 cents. Australia added a war tax of half a penny on December 10th, 1941. These 2 covers are both from 1942, so they required a 2.5 penny stamp or a 2 penny stamp with a halfpenny roo to pay the British Commonwealth rate. I mentioned New Zealand, so let's quickly go through the New Zealand. Here we have the 4 postmarks that the New Zealand force. The force arrived in mid-1942, and in fact, Australia was rapidly building an airstrip because with the war in the Pacific, they were worried about the cable station that was still operating on Norfolk Island, and they were worried about it being a base for Japanese or German attacks on New Zealand and Australia. And more as they moved up into Guadalcanal and places like that, Norfolk Island was a great refueling stop. In fact, at the peak in 1943, they were getting 150 aircraft a month, or roughly 5 aircraft a day going through Norfolk Island from particularly the Royal New Zealand Air Force, because they were ferrying troops and supplies into the Pacific. The bottom right here is a generic cancel that New Zealand forces used quite all over the Pacific. And the only way you can identify that with Norfolk Island is through the either the triangular censor mark, because we know what numbers applied to Norfolk Island, or on the back it actually has the name of the addressee, and you can trace that down to somebody who was on Norfolk Island. But the big force that came in 1942 was called N Force, and it was almost 1,500 men. Now, this island isn't very large. It's 13.5 square miles, or if you like, 35 square kilometers, and you're going to put a force of 1,500 people and dump it on the island immediately. Needless to say, they did a lot of building. They helped finish the airport so their planes could land. The airport was finished on Christmas Day, basically, Christmas Day 1942, and the first plane actually landed on Christmas Day 1942. It wasn't supposed to. The airport wasn't supposed to open for another 2 or 3 days, but the pilot couldn't resist landing his New Zealand Air Force plane. And I think he was sanctioned for it, but he had a great smile as a result of doing this, I think. So the New Zealand forces came in, N Force, and you can see the N in the postmark there. They were around. This generic label was used on and off from 1942 to 1945, although mainly 42, 43. N Force came in 42 and used that cancellation till March 1943. Then they were replaced by another battalion and an Army post office called Army Post Office. They set up Army Post Office 400. So New Zealand Expeditionary Forces along the top, Army Post Office 400 across the bottom. And this is August 43, so it's in the period, and it's going to the Ford Motor Company. Maybe they were asking for some parts or something, I don't know, for their equipment. And then the Army exited and they gave it over to the Air Force because the base now was being used to ferry supplies, and the Air Force with a, so you've got a Royal New Zealand Air Force Council with a New Zealand APO E, and this E is very important. This covers from 1946, so it is, in fact, towards the end of the war. But collecting Norfolk Island is fun because you're not only sitting with Australian colony stamps and Australian stamps, but here we have a period where we're dealing with New Zealand cancellations. And these are quite difficult to find now. They're not scarce, they're not rare, but they're not easy to come by anymore. And it's a challenge for someone collecting Norfolk Island. And by the way, there's two of this cancel, one with a 1 and one with a 2. I only have the one with a 1 at the moment. I will get the other one at some stage, I'm sure. But that's a fascinating period. So post-war, here we have covers from May 47. These two, 8th of May, both from the 8th of May 1947. Postage was still 2.5 because the war tax was still in effect. And so this is a local cover going to New South Wales. This is obviously a philatelic cover going to a stamp company showing, but a beautiful cancel of that island, again with the AUST dot cancellation. And the bottom cover here is a really interesting cover because you'll notice it has more than 2.5. It's got 2.5 on it and then an extra threepenny. And I remember saying that threepenny paid was the rate for the registration fee. Well, it was also the rate for the an airmail fee. But Norfolk Island didn't have any airmail force, except the Royal New Zealand Air Force was continuing to shuttle things back and forth over the Pacific. So even in the post-war period, and I think that cover is from 26th of May 1947. Even over the post-war period, the Royal New Zealand Air Force would carry the covers. So airmail was a possibility. It was carried by the Royal New Zealand Air Force down to Auckland, New Zealand, and then the flights from Auckland, New Zealand up to Australia would have brought it to Sydney, New South Wales. And in fact, you had to pay full postage from the 1st of April 1947. And so, in fact, this is the 26th of May 47. So this is an evidence of an airmail cover from New Zealand that was covered under wartime conditions by the Royal New Zealand Air Force. And finally, we get to see what I've been talking about. There was the Australian Ost dot postmark, one with a K that looked like that and one with a K that looks like that. And then in 1947, a new Ost without a dot was brought in, and the K looked like this first K here. So you've got these were all being used in 1947. And you might notice these all are for 6th of June, 1947. And there's that registration label with Norfolk Island, New South Wales, all 6th of June, 1947. Why would so many covers be postmarked that date? Well, look here, last day cover. It turned out that Norfolk Island in 1923 had asked the Brits if they could issue their own stamps. They needed additional revenue sources. I mean, the little government on Norfolk Island is doing 3 levels of government. They're dealing with national government levels like immigration and import and export duties, which were generating a lot of revenues. They're dealing with state level type responsibilities like health and education. And then they're dealing with municipal level responsibilities like roads and bridges and things like that. So they needed revenues to handle all the different levels of services that were needed on the island. And in 1923, they said, look, can't we have our own stamps? That'll give us another revenue source, in particular, in addition to import and export duties. And of course, they have fees for owning a television set. They still have fees for owning a television set on Norfolk Island. If you have a television set, you pay 200 Australian dollars a year or something. I can't remember what it is then. But anyway, so they requested it again in 1939. Stamps were actually produced, they were produced right before the Second World War. And they were held over the Second World War to be issued after. It was originally announced they'd be issued in 1940. And of course, by then the wartime occurred. And they were held right through the wartime period. And then they were destroyed at the end of the period. And the same design was then reprinted for their own stamps. So the 6th of June, 1947 was the last day that you could use Australian stamps on Norfolk Island. And they wanted to introduce the new stamps, which I'll talk about in a moment, on the day that the Pitcairners arrived on Norfolk Island, which is the 8th of June. But the 6th of June was a Friday. The 8th of June, the first issue of new Norfolk Island stamps would have been on the 8th of June, which would have been a Sunday. Well, first of all, the post office isn't open. Secondly, they're pretty religious on Norfolk Island, so that wasn't going to fly. And then, so you'd think, okay, they'll release them on the 9th of June, the Monday. But the 9th of June, a Monday, is a holiday because that's the day they call Bounty Day, because that's the day that they represent when the Norfolk Pitcairn Islanders landed. So that's a national holiday. You couldn't introduce stamps on that date. So it was delayed until the 10th of June. So Norfolk Island finally got its own stamps on the 10th of June, 1947. And that brings me to the design that's at the back of all of these slides. The design is based on a photograph that is used in many different Norfolk Island tourist publications around that time. And Manley, the engraver at the Australian Note Bureau, took that photograph and engraved that scene of Norfolk Island. This is called Bell Bay. And so these are Ball Bay. And this is the bay that forms the front piece of the photograph. You go then around here to Kingston and the penal settlement, which is over here. And in the background, that's Phillip Island. That's not Norfolk Island. That's the big island, Phillip Island, in the background, which is uninhabited. And in fact, was inhabited over the period by rabbits and pigs and things like that, which the British in the convict period had put on the island, and then the officers could go over and shoot pigs and rabbits and so on for entertainment. So it's very denuded now, and finally they're trying to bring it back. But this is a view from Ball Bay to Phillip Island, and that photograph became the basis for the first stamp issue. The first stamp issue, called the Ball Bay issue, 12 stamps, all of the same design. Blank registration label, still remember, they're not part of New South Wales anymore, so they didn't want to use the New South Wales labels. They had to, so they got their own hand stamp in lilac. A new cancellation, 10th of June 47. Normally June wouldn't be J-U-N, it would be J-E. And Australia without a period at the bottom. So this is the full set of the first stamps, and
all on one cover.
And by the way, in fact,
All the stamps are on one cover.
still looks very much like that today. Here's the picture today of what that view looks like. You notice there's no condos or anything on this. It still looks like the picture back then. So moving forward, we've got first day covers. Some have a broader end than the others, so there's 2 stamp issues. We've got interesting cachets that were applied on the island. We've got blank registration labels, and the one that has New South Wales on, they used a blue crayon to mark out New South Wales. The first flight into Norfolk Island occurred on the 25th. They did a survey flight on the 25th of September, 1947. And finally, by October, a first flight from Sydney to Norfolk Island and Norfolk Island to Sydney gave them airmail service. This use of the Bell Bay stamp issue is really quite important, because if you look at it, it's the 26th of September. So it's the return flight of the survey flight. New South Wales is crossed out. And again, these are different rates. This one is interesting because the tuppence halfpenny rate was still in effect. They abolished the halfpenny war tax, but then raised the rate to tuppence halfpenny. But registration was threepence, airmail was threepence, so you needed an additional 6pence to cover that. Again, more use of these first stamps. Norfolk Island with New South Wales crossed out because they're not part of New South Wales anymore. This up here is a very interesting rate in 1951. This rate was only in place for 7 months. It's a 6-penny rate to Australia. Postage was threepence only for 7 months, and the airmail cost another threepence. And finally, the late fee, which was tuppence. So in fact, by the time these 2 covers were being mailed, it was 1952, and the late fee could be paid at the airport. A tuppenny late fee could be paid at the Norfolk Island airport. So you had threepence halfpenny for postage, threepence for the airmail, and tuppence for the late fee, 2 pennies for the late fee. I won't bother with this one. But somebody going to Internal Revenue Series, they jacked up the airmail rates to the rest of the world in 1952. This one going to the US. All right, so very quickly, this first Ball Bay series had a special cancellation for the 2nd of June, which was the Coronation Day flights, and a big from Norfolk Island to Great Britain and from Great Britain to Norfolk Island, also on an air letter. More uses of the Ball Bay issue. This is a tuppence for a late fee on this one. And you can get packet boat covers, which are a lot of fun. The first, the rates continued to be increased. Postage rates continued to be increased over the period. And in fact, they started to not have the right denomination stamps. So they brought in their first set. And this set was all different denominations than the first set, the Ball Bay set. And they all have convict heritage buildings, with the one exception of the Air Force, the airstrip that was built in 1942. This is purported to be the first governor's residence. In fact, it was a storage building. The governor's residence was just about 50 meters away. But if you go there today, you still can find the governor's residence. There it is. There's my picture from a year ago, looking exactly like the stamp and the cachet. And this is called the Salt House. That was built in the 2nd penal period. And there's the Salt House still sitting at Norfolk Island today. Registration labels with a hand stamp and with New South Wales cancelled out were in use. that time. The Qantas flight was extended by Tasman Airlines in 1955. And here's the cover from Auckland to Norfolk and Norfolk to Auckland, using the Ball Bay stamp and the airport stamp for the 8 rate to Norfolk to New Zealand these days. Formula aerograms readily available and used. The first commemorative issue commemorated the landing of the Pitcairn Islanders, and they had a special cancellation with 1856 to 1956. And for the first time, we were beginning to see cachet covers. This is the Australian Post Office cover. This is a cover from Guthrie in Perth, West Australia, and this is a WCS Wellesley Cover Service cover. Notice it doesn't say first day cover, it says souvenir cover. All right, and then they started to continue to run out because of the postal rate increase, continue to run out of the right sorts of denominations. So they overprinted the 7.5 penny with a 7 penny and the 8.5 penny stamp with 8 pence. And these are examples of a first day cover, which I wouldn't normally show, going to St. Helena, which I like. And this is the use of an Ost without the dot postmark. They were phased out in August, and new Ball Bay stamps for those two values, threepence and 2 shillings, were introduced in 59 because these were really commemoratives in 1956, so they'd outlasted their due. These cachets are from, again, Guthrie cachets. Looking for packet boat marks, there's a lot of fun in this period. And the first day of issue postmark was used on a stamp that borrowed the Australian stamp and overprinted 5 pence North Island. Between the issue of the Australian stamp in April 1959, and the issuance of the Norfolk Island stamp in October, the postal rate had gone from 4 pennies to 5 pennies, so they had to overprint. And the argument here was this guy, who was the first postmaster in New South Wales, by the way, he had been a convict on Norfolk Island, went back to New South Wales, got re-established, got his free pass and became the postmaster. And the postmaster of New South Wales was also the postmaster of Norfolk Island. So that was their rationale for introducing this stamp. Still shortages of the right rates occurred, and they kept overprinting stamps to get the right rates. These are really quite difficult to find used on cover, until we finally got a second definitive, which are flower stamps. Queen's portrait on this one, and the use of flower stamps. Here's the use of the 5 penny flower stamp with a packet boat, New Hebrides packet boat. This one is going to New Guinea, which I like, and this is an aerogram using the 10 penny rate, which is the Salt House, but it's now a multicolored stamp in this set. High values were introduced. Here's the 2 and 5 and 2 and 8, and this one's going to Goderich, Ontario, and a 10 shilling for parcels. And now they finally have a Norfolk Island without New South Wales, a Norfolk Island hand stamp. This is the first day of issue, and there are 2 different versions of this, one with a dash here and a dot here, and one with a dot here and a dash there. But in my display, I investigate that, but we don't have the time now to do it. Norfolk Island then started to introduce Christmas stamps. In 1960, they borrowed the Australian design and just changed the name and the colour. And in 1961, they borrowed the Australian design and changed the name and the colour. And they had, in 1960, a local government advisory. Remember, they weren't really in control of their own affairs, but a local government advisory council. Then the fish stamps came out, a whole series of fish stamps and Anzac Stamp. And this is over the period in 1963, 4, 62, 3, 4. And you can track down the rates of these without too much trouble. 10 penny, this is 10 penny aerogram, this is 10 penny for a letter card. Australia went into decimal currency in 1966, so they overprinted the entire set of the stamps in use with overprints. And here are the higher values with the first day of issue. And here is, I like this, with the old stamp and then the new stamp overprinted. And this 5 shilling stamp is a bloody bridge, and that's another one of the myths. When this bridge was being built, the chain gang had an overseer, and all of a sudden the overseer went missing. And the people in the chain gang claimed that the convicts in the chain gang claimed he went for a swim in the sea and disappeared. However, there is evidence that he is in fact part of the bridge and built into the bridge. Another one of the convict myths from Norfolk Island. And there's Bloody Bridge, what it looks like today. It's still there, it's still used. There's still nothing around. It still looks like a bucolic scene like it was. And these is some commercial uses of the overprinted stamps of that early decimal period. Now, what country introduces a last day of issue cancel? And why would you even collect these? They're unaddressed envelopes. Well, first of all, last day of issue is quite an unusual cancel. And secondly, it was introduced, I thought, with the last day of issue of these overprinted stamps. So 14th of April, 67 was the first use of the last day of issue. But as I dug into my collection, I suddenly found one on the 7th of March, 67 for the Christmas stamp. And so, in fact, the last day of issue cancel was used earlier than that has been reported in the literature. And it's about the right distance in dates, about 5 months between the first and the last issue. Here's some additional stamps. And in fact, 21st anniversary of that Qantas service that we talked about, nice Cinderellas, imperf and perforated, used on stamps signed by the pilot. These are obviously philatelic. In fact, we're getting more and more philatelic as we're getting through here. A beautiful bird set, and here's 3 uses of the bird stamps to different locations. And a new postmark has been introduced, Norfolk Island across the bottom with dashes on the side. Now, there are about 9 different versions of this postmark, depending on how long the dash is and what period it's in. And it's fun to try and track them down and measure them. This was followed by a set of building stamps, the old convict buildings. This was the jail that I mentioned with the 5 wings to it, if you like. A packet boat stamp showing a Christmas stamp. So they're roaring along. They're introducing 12 and 14 stamp definitive series every 3 years, plus Christmas stamps, plus, wow, they did a Tonga. They went peel and stick type stamps, 1974, 1975. And all of a sudden, these were commercially used. They were quite popular, actually, and commercially used and quite successful. But again, we're beginning to see the stamp program getting a little bit quirky. That postmark is from 1974. And look, we've got a big souvenir sheet. The stamps were valuable. And in 1974, the stamps were valued at their value on this. 1974, they started to introduce pictorial first day of issue stamps. This is for the royal visit. The stamps were supposed to be issued on the 8th of Feb. They didn't, because of a storm, they didn't arrive until after the post office closed on the 8th of Feb, which was a Friday. The royal visit was delayed. The post office opened on Saturday morning so they could sell all the stamps and envelopes they prepared overnight for 2 hours on Saturday morning. So they kept the 8th of February date. But in fact, the yacht Britannia didn't arrive until the 10th of February. So the visit didn't take place till then. Finally, we're getting into a set of 4 stamps for the scouts, for the guides, a set of 4 stamps for the scouts. Things are going off the rails quite quickly. Another flight anniversary, we'll drop by. And this is the introduction of prop jets into the island. And this cancel is 3 different types depending on where they're lined up. This 2 is lined up for like that one. This 2 down here is lined up like this one. And so, and this is one of the first additional cachets that they provided to Norfolk Islanders. So that even though the postage was paid to Australia, in fact, the postage only needed to be paid to Norfolk Island. I'll come back to that a little later on. I know time is pressing, so I'll wrap up quickly. Things then started to get really crazy. They brought out a set for the bicentennial, and at least they tied it to common themes like whaling, Thanksgiving, World War II, and this little guy, the California hen, and these run all over the island. So there's got a US bicentennial. We then get into the Roland Hill. Christmas stamp sets now are no longer one, they're 3 stamps to the set. And the numbers are just proliferating like crazy. Then they thought they'd get into the royalty game. So they got a anniversary, 25th anniversary stamp here. They've got a Her Majesty the Queen Mum's 80th anniversary. They've got a coronation, a 25th anniversary of Her Majesty's coronation. And then, of course, they got Charles and Di with fancy cancels here. And all of a sudden, things are really big souvenir sheets issued with Pitcairn Island, special cancellations for days of issue, and finally, Australian PSE, but a nice cancellation mimicking the Australian, the 50th anniversary of his flight from Auckland to Norfolk Island to Lord Howe Island to Sydney. Finally, they started to get into aerograms and pre-stamped envelopes. That aerogram has a little cancel with a little dot at the back, which is what this one is, but it was supposed to only have this cancel. So somehow this first pre-stamped envelope got a new cancel for a first day of issue, but it also got what issue in August for the aerogram was also used in October. And then all of a sudden, the first day of issue cancels went nutso. They went to ANPEX in Brisbane in 82. They went to AussiePex in Australia in 84. They went to Stampex in New Zealand in 85. They went to Ameripex in 86 in the US. And they went to Stampex 86 in Australia. And of course, these cancels are all official Norfolk Island cancels. The postal historian by now was overwhelmed and going nuts and canceled their standing order subscription. These, by the way, these pre-stamped envelopes were used, and so it's not like they were just confetti for stamp collectors. They were genuinely used. A couple of final little comments. Norfolk Island had this wonderful little idea of local mail. There's one post office in Norfolk Island, and every family has a post office box at that. So there's no delivery. You go to the post office to pick up your mail and to drop off your mail. So they had a special rate. If you was mailing to someone on Norfolk Island, a local mail, a penny rate. And so here's a penny rate to Norfolk Island, and here's Mr. Burgess again, Post Box 91, Norfolk Island, a penny 1 cent rate, and here's a slightly different use of the 1 cent rate by, in fact, the commercial establishment. Again, this is Post Box 85, so 85 is pretty close to 91 post boxes. There's about 2,000 people on Norfolk Island, so they needed about 400 or 500 post boxes apparently. So this local rate has a lot of interesting. Here we go, purchasing officer, Norfolk Island Hospital. This one was to Grassy Road, and this is to the Norfolk Island Bakery, all with a penny rate. Penny rate was very useful if you wanted to do souvenir covers like the Rotary Club, because it didn't cost a whole lot for postage to do a souvenir cover. So you could have a marathon flight around Australia to raise money for the local hospital and sell these covers to boot. And the same thing for the airmail. Finally, they really did adhere to international. So if you mailed your local rate and you forgot to put a stamp on it, it was twice the efficiency. So a 2 cent stamp was necessary as a tax. The last day of the Norfolk Island penny postage was 18th of July, 1980, and then it went to 5 cents. Official mail Stamps earlier on, this is a 1930 cover, 1944 cover, 1947 cover. Again, this is the last day of issue. And we see 1952, 1960, all of these are commercial, either the registration or the post office. And then all of a sudden we get, this is going to, there's Mr. Burgess again. Cascades, remember that's the Northern Port. And this is coming to Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. And then they started to introduce a special oval cachet, 3 versions. The early one had a dot, the middle one had a dash, the last one had a star, and you can start looking for different ways of the Norfolk Island administration. Some are printed, some are stamped. We're exhausted. So by this time, some guy ran his standing order account to $1.28, didn't renew, terrible guy. And this was the final oval that they've been used. A couple of miscellaneous things. No one seems to know where Norfolk Island is, and you can have a wonderful collection of missent. Here, the Brits missent the Norfolk Island mail to Pago Pago, Samoa. The Aussies missent the Norfolk Island mail to the Solomon Islands. The New Zealanders missent, when they should have known better, the Norfolk Island mail back to Great Britain because of probably Norfolk, England. So you can have a lot of fun looking at missent mail to Norfolk Island. Secondly, I like Qsl cards. As you all know, these do go through the mail, but they're not mailed per se. They're usually sent to a central location in a covering envelope. So very few of them have any stamps or postmarks on them, but they do go through the mail. So here's one from 1948, one from 1952, one from 1967, and I have others too. This one I like because it's Papua New Guinea, which I also collect. It's cancelled with a Thursday Island packet boat, which I also collect, going inwards to Norfolk Island. That's a real gem. 3 different collections. This was from 1993. Dear David, you should try and visit Norfolk Island sometime, even if only for your interest in Pitcairn Island, etc., etc., etc. Cheers, O. Our wonderful member Owen White sent me this postcard when he visited Norfolk Island. It's a treasure. Finally, they put out stamps for cows. And currently, Australia took control of Norfolk Island. Now, they don't need speed limits on Norfolk Island. There are cows everywhere doing the mowing of the lawns. In fact, the fences on Norfolk Island are to keep the cows out of your property, not to keep them in. And the cows roam everywhere. This is the old idea of the commons. Anyone can graze the cows anywhere on Norfolk Island in the common lands. And they're rounded up once a year. But in 2015, Norfolk Island finally was basically bankrupt. They asked Australia to bail them out, and Australia said, no, we're fed up with this. We're taking over. Norfolk Island had been proud of the fact that it had never had an income tax. But therefore they couldn't afford their hospital and all their services. And Australia said, no, in 2016, you're now going to adhere to Australian rules. So Norfolk Island stamps now are issued by the Australian Post. And in fact, that wonderful little local rate is now no longer in existence. Thank you very much.
Do the official thank you. This was a journey. It was a 3-pronged journey you took us on to Norfolk. You gave us a historical journey, a travelogue, and of course a philatelic journey. I totally want to go there now. You made it come so alive, giving us glimpses on the history side of some very rare looking early documents, an idea of the hardscrabble convict life and convict myths that arose. Then as it gets more developed into the cable and the influence of that on the island. On the travel side, you showed us bits of its flora and fauna. I consider that Ball Bay first issue to be an iconic issue, and it's an iconic scene to have the photograph of it from the time and also from your collection. That was wonderful. And also, I really appreciate that you put in maps. Maps to me tell a big story and put a place to location. So that was wonderful that you started it off with maps and give us all an idea of where we're talking about. And then, of course, the philately. That's what this group is all about. The early registration, the early aerophilately with 1931 covers, rate covers with double printed matter, short-lived rates, late fees. These are wonderful pieces of postal history. Covering the Empire Airmail Scheme, all up rates for incoming letters. Fascinating stuff. The censorship, the on-active service, you covered pretty well everything. And then one of my favorite things in postal history, exotic destinations. I mean, Norfolk to Thailand, there can't be a lot of mail from Norfolk to Thailand. Same thing with St. Helena and New Guinea. So thank you for taking us on this journey, and I look forward to the time I can make it over to beautiful Norfolk Island.
Thank you very much, Ingo.